I'd say in brief, it's that not only does IQVIA offer what most would expect being that full-service CRO package and delivery, we also have an orchestrated suite of patient site technologies inclusive of our IRT platform. I think, as evidence, might talk a bit about Kara Woodruff's presentation today. We're really trying to be a leader in the space when it comes to considering a lot of therapeutic area specifics, not only from an IRT perspective around how, in her example, cell and gene therapy trials need to be planned and sourced for, but also just the integrations between our various patient and site technologies. So in kind of getting to be around our booth today, as well as a part of the conversations, it's been interesting to me to see not only how new topics of discussion or kind of unanticipated topics of intense discussion like regulatory requirements are coming up, but also just how the kind of audience has received the feedback of trying to, again, promote site and patient technologies in this space. So yeah, it's been, in brief, really just putting out there that we have this tech ecosystem and really putting forth ways we can try to innovate further between those technologies. Busy, but very good. I know you were just talking about this. I think it's been wonderful to see the amount of engagement in a little smaller conference space between the presentations as well as the engagement at our booth and I know others' booths. There's been a lot of really vibrant discussion. We probably have someone coming to the booth every few minutes, kind of engaging in discussions around their trial needs, kind of some perspective feedback based off the talk, such as Kara's, Brenda's, and Lauren's, and others, and really just active 2 to 3 people discussions where we'll have multiple people at the booths at the same time, discussing not just where the industry is today and maybe their specific trial requirements for something upcoming Q3 next year, but also just feedback as where's this therapeutic area going to go in a year or two? Kind of what are your thoughts from a tech perspective on it? And it's been really, coming in late yesterday and being a little tired, it's been really, enlivening to have that level of stimulation. So having a good time so far, definitely pleasantly exhausting getting all the feedback from everybody. The big one that also came up during the conversations was a lot around, kind of constantly updating regulatory constraints and regulatory feedback and regulatory guidance when it comes to how exactly we can custom build some of these technologies, how they're leveraged not only in the preclinical trials, but also all the up through phase 3, just kind of where the handoff might be from a small pharma to a large pharma, and really just some of the constraints, but also just some of the considerations that have to be taken into account when it comes to resourcing and funding and just anything with technology being, well, how do we best build the correct solution? That's more generic. I'd say specifically, we've had a couple questions really come up around customizability of the IRT platform, with our IQVIA IRT being one example. Kind of per Kara's talk on cell and gene therapy, just kind of what are, again, some of the constraints that come into play when you are kind of building multiple logic checks or kind of stage gates among different user groups, whether that's sites, whether that's sponsors themselves, whether that's a supplier, to make sure that steps are being undertaken correctly. So kind of both sides of it. We've had more broader, again, feedback on where the industry's going in the next couple of years, in addition to how we might instance a IRT build specifically. And that's been really, again, engaging for us at the booth because we want to account for both. We come here to provide as much input as we can from the technology specific side, but take into account where the technology fits in the broader ecosystem. Yeah, so it's funny, if you see at our booth, we have IRT being interactive response technology. You'll see one of our booths says, placard says integrated response technology. And specifically for IQVIA, it fits into our orchestrated patient suite of technologies and site suite of technologies that help to facilitate the randomization, screening and randomization of patients, as well as the dispensation of the study drug. Now, a big focus of this conference today is really how those technologies fit into that space and how they work with suppliers to ensure that that IP is being developed, sourced correctly to sites and patients, but also additional steps are taken throughout the trial lifecycle to make sure that patients are correctly randomized or screened or re-randomized, and that additional constraints are being taken into account when it comes to drug dosing, titrating a dose, things like that. So those are the tools in which, or the ways in which an IRT uses a tool. Where it really fits into the ecosystem or that broad clinical trial process is right from the onset. When it comes to planning what technologies will implement, whether you're again pursuing more traditional IVRS methods or paper planning for managing those things, or via an IRT, a technical way of managing it, where does that fit with your endpoint collection strategy? If that's done via paper COA or electronic COA. Your consenting, how does your electronic or paper consenting feed into an IRT? So it starts from the beginning with how we build out these technologies during trial planning and study planning, but also through the trial life cycle through first patient screen, first patient in, again, treatment all the way through study closeout. These technologies are kind of being used by multiple parties throughout to ensure, again, proper dosing, to ensure that upfront randomization, and to ensure that all these transactions, as they call them, are being instanced correctly in the system to ensure proper drug supply and proper patient activities are documented. So an all long answer, but really from the beginning, as far as any sort of technology prep throughout the study life cycle, just to make sure it's being constantly referenced by the sites and used by sites in the correct way. I think it's both. I think I wouldn't say it's getting in the way per se, and I think there's definitely aid being given. I'd think, and this is again, Kara Woodruff gave a wonderful talk on this, you just referenced, and for all who can see a record of an eventual recording of it, I recommend doing so. But essentially what she covered was that a lot of times when you see these cell and gene therapy lines, they're developed by maybe smaller organization, and it might be a riskier proposition. You look at higher success rates in these instances, but it might be where there's less initial resourcing. So they identify a specific line of research, and they go after that line to see if there's a successful application for cell and gene therapy. Now, she went into a lot of the complexities from an IRT perspective when it comes to IP management, getting that, sourcing that biologic sample, whether that's done in and you're going to correct me on this, my team, an analogous way, or maybe an allogenic way when it comes to, again, getting that, kind of developing the specific IP for that individual patient, personalized biologic, and then sending it back, and all the complexity of all those steps. So that puts a lot on a smaller organization to manage and also fund that. So as you progress through, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, where a larger company or larger pharma might step in could be beneficial from a financing standpoint, as well as just from an organizational standpoint. They might want to have more scrutiny over how that's managed. Seeing the existing phase 1 success to extend to a phase 2, phase 3, you might need that level of organization. So I'd say it's in the middle where you want to, if I'm a smaller company, I want to maintain that identity, the passion behind kind of building out and planning for a cell and gene therapy trial. But as it's successful and as you progress into phase 2 and phase 3 trials, maybe thinking of how that larger pharma approach can aid you and kind of be correctly regulatorily adherent, as well as get the necessary outreach. You can have more funding for patient recruitment, things to that effect. So it's definitely both. Yeah, the biggest one I saw in the talks and that have come up at the exhibition booth has probably been around regulatory updates, right? I mean, if you're looking at, and my expertise particularly is in ECOA, but if you're looking at the patient technology space or IoT space, you have to consider recent updates when it comes to ICH E6R3 guidelines, recent FDA guidance, EU CTR guidance, and specifically around any sort of it's hypotheticals, but questions that have come up today, even in Kara's talk, about if you're doing cell and gene therapy, how do you kind of ensure that if there's any modifications to the IP or modifications to drug, that's taken into account, that's traceable, that is adjusted in the platform, things to that effect. And I think, it's important to take into account what the technology can provide, what the technology can provide, but also what is outside the technology's remit, or what's the technology's responsibility, so to speak, and making sure that integration between making sure the regulatory compliance is present, but also making sure that the technology doesn't overcommit to things that aren't in its process flow is very clearly identified in an SOP or a guidance document, and just during the development process. Because you're going to get a lot of questions like we received today that are very good questions of, what is the regulatory risk here, or what is the safety risk here? And it's a very good question, but it might be one for the supplier. It might be one for the IP manufacturer. It might not be one for a technology. So I think it's a tale as old as time, but we have a lot of exciting technologies and solutions, making sure they don't overcommit to what they're capable of doing. Very common, you might hear that in a talk of, the technology can do this, or it can track this for the site, and it can automate this. All very wonderful things, but making sure patient safety comes first, regulatory adherence comes first, and that it's not overcommitting to being able to account for some of those things when that might not be the case. I'd say regulatory, and then just in broadly, innovation, in a really happy way to put it, just different ways of approaching custom builds, different ways of approaching particular therapeutic areas. We've had some people come by the booth and discuss. And I know, as a last thing that was focused today, the human element. I know it's a little bit cliche, but I believe it was in Lauren's talk, went into a lot of anecdotes around the operational support and working in help desk and working with those escalations. And I can talk about technology, regulatory considerations, and development considerations all day, but the people managing the development, managing the trials that are in progress, I think those are forgotten sometimes. So I think it was really nice to hear that, personalized approach with a little bit of brevity, a little bit of humor. And I think that's also shown through today is that a boots on the ground perspective of who's working with these, whether it's the site from a training perspective, whether it's the project teams and customer support, customer care teams from a operational perspective, and just how they work together. So I know it was a bit there, but I think design, what the technology can and can't manage, and then again, just the approach of the people, or rather the personalized nature of supporting these tools. So yeah, a lot of vibrant discussion.